Welcome to the Freak Show, fellow freaks.
I'm Matthew Brockmeyer.
And I'm Krista Carmen.
And as always, this is
Murder Coaster.
Step right up, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our 3-act sideshow tent. Come and hear 3 acts of true crime, carnage, and terror. Yes, 3 tales of murder and mayhem. Hear the story that shocked France, the Papin Sisters, servant girls who brutally murdered and sexually mutilated their mistresses. Hear the tale of an evil clown and the death of the Clown King. And as our pièce de résistance, we have the elusive Satan Rock that Ed and Lorraine Warren warned you about. Yes, evil clowns and strange murdering sisters and Satan Rock. Right this way, right this way. Let's get on with the show.
Let's begin. Act 1. Bring in the clowns. In 1854, William Bernard was a 13-year-old boy selling peanuts and candy at a street circus. He'd been born in Cincinnati, Ohio, but had gone west and was now living in San Francisco, where he'd peddle confections on the streets for a living. During this time, San Francisco was experiencing rapid growth due to the California gold rush, which attracted people from all over the world seeking their fortune. And there were many diverse cultures and a crazy mix of languages echoing through the busy Bayside city.
Before the 1868 earthquake and subsequent fires, most of the buildings were made out of wood, much of it salvaged from abandoned ships when seamen ran off to dig for gold in the hills. The streets were narrow and muddy, with boardwalks for the pedestrians in the nicer areas. It was a very Wild West kind of town.
William often sold his candy and peanuts at the Pacific Street Circus, which, despite its name, was apparently on Stockin Street and described as a, quote, small Spanish theatrical representation, end quote.
As William sat on the edge of the circus, hawking peanuts as jugglers worked their magic, a clown came dancing up to him, face smeared in white, with a big menacing grin painted on in red. And before William realized what was happening, the big dancing clown had grabbed him by the ankles, pulled him up into the air, and began to spin him round and round, sending his peanuts and candy flying.
Spiraling and spiraling, the clown went faster and faster. He spun the teenage boy as the kid screamed and pleaded for him to stop. But as the cacophony of the circus organ and the merry howls of delight from the spectators filled the night, the clown kept on spinning the boy until blood began to flow from his mouth, spattering the crowd.
When the clown was done with his act, William lay in a heap, unresponsive. An ambulance was called, and he was taken to the hospital, where he died.
The clown was a man named Manuel Reyes, and he was described at the time as, quote, a mentally defective clown, end quote.
A coroner's inquest was held, as was reported on in the Daily Alta California, Volume 10, number 336, on the 7th of December, 1858, which stated,
The coroner held an inquest today upon the body of William Bernard, the boy who was injured last night at the Pacific Street Circus by the clown swinging him around. A post-mortem examination was held up on the body, the result of which proved to be that death was caused by a rupture of the left pulmonary artery. The coroner's jury returned a verdict of death being produced by accident.
But it was then discovered that the mentally defective clown
was a suspect in 2 other murders, and he was arrested for the death of William Bernard.
But then, when the case was reviewed by a grand jury, the charges were dropped. However, the killer clown Manuel Reyes would later be sent to prison in 1858 for assault upon a police officer. During the trial, the clown would slap at his face, jump about, and mutter incoherent remarks.
Now check this out. I did some digging and found something that I have not seen mentioned in any other article or blog about this case. On a site I found called newspapers.com, someone posted up an old newspaper and highlighted a tiny article about this clown. The article reads,
Marysville, California, March 11th, 1859. Manuel Reyes, lately engaged in a walking match at the museum, has been sent to Stockton as a lunatic. He is said to have killed 2 men and got clear on the plea of insanity.
It's just this tiny blurb that's highlighted, and there's really no context or thoughts given to it by whoever posted it. It just says it's proof that the clown had killed before. I'll put a link if you want to check it out. Even read the rest of this newspaper. See what people in 1859 Gold Country were reading about. But this article would have been written 5 years after the death of William Bernard. And I don't know what, quote, engaged in a walking match at the museum, end quote, means. But it's very interesting nonetheless.
It sure is. William Bernard was buried in the Yerba Buena Cemetery on January 11th, 1854. But after the earthquake and fires destroyed much of the city in 1868, new infrastructure was put in and the area was just built over. Today, the Asian Art Museum and Public Library sits atop the spot.
Ooh, if ghosts are real, that place has to be haunted as hell. And old school San Francisco ghosts were a notoriously feisty bunch, being all outlaws and gold miners.
But his body may not even be there below that library after all. For according to thedeadhistory.com, the Yerba Buena Cemetery was notorious as a place for people to steal bodies and use the fat to make soap. Apparently, it was very common because the environmental conditions in that spot were just right for the formation of adipose cere, or grave wax. Meaning, instead of putrefying and rotting, the fat of the body would saponify into wax. The corpse basically turning into a waxy, fatty substance, perfect for soap.
Adipocere. Whoa, so bizarre to think your flesh can just turn into wax. Killer clowns and soap-making grave robbers. What a show, what an act. And now, ladies and gentlemen, Act 2. From a tragic story of a killer clown to the tragic murder of the king of the clown.
Act 2. Sugar Cereal and the Death of the Clown King. The Battle Creek Sanitarium was a world-renowned health resort in Battle Creek, Michigan, started in 1866 and run by followers of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, who are vegetarian. In 1876, John Harvey Kellogg became the superintendent in charge of the resort, and his brother, W.K. Kellogg, worked as his bookkeeper and assistant.
Because of the vegetarian diet of the resort, the Kellogg brothers were always on the lookout for new forms of meat-free food.
One night in 1894, a batch of wheat berry dough was left out and had hardened. But instead of throwing it out, John Kellogg put the stiff dough through the rollers, where the hardened pieces broke apart into delicate little flakes. John's brother, W.K., then baked the flakes crisp and served it to members of the health resort, who loved it. The new invention was called Wheat Flakes, and they were a huge hit. Soon the Kellogg brothers were packaging the product for members to take home.
John only wanted the wheat flakes to be available to guests and members of Battle Creek Sanitarium. But WK, he had different ideas. He wanted to market the product worldwide. After a falling out over the issue and a lawsuit between the two brothers, WK began manufacturing Kellogg toasted cornflakes on a large scale, and by 1909 was making 120,000 boxes every single day.
But by the 1950s, what was originally marketed as a health food to vegetarians had turned into the breakfast of children, taking the burden off of overworked mothers who could now just put these toasted cereal flakes into a bowl, add some milk, and call it a morning.
And what do kids love? Sugar! Pour it on.
So, to compete in the increasingly ever sugary breakfast cereal market, Kellogg's created the most sugary product on the market, leaving the other sugar cereals in the dust with Sugar Smacks, boasting the most amount of sugar on any pre-sweetened cereal at a whopping 51%. Yes, over half of the product was just pure sugar.
And what else do kids love besides sugar? Clowns! So they used clowns to promote this new teeth-rotting, diabetes-creating product that had once been touted as a health food.
And the clown they got to promote their puffed corn caked in sugar was none other than the king of clowns himself, Paul Young.
Born in 1900, Paul Young was a world-renowned circus entertainer. He'd literally been born into the circus and was performing acrobatics and singing on the vaudeville circuit by the time he was just 8 years old. By 1917, at the age of 17, he had joined the Ringling Brothers Circus, and by 1934, he was chief clown, a position he would hold for 25 years.
And in 1952, Kellogg's came knocking, asking him to be the mascot of their new cereal marketed to children.
The images of those boxes featuring Paul in his iconic makeup, a red ball on his nose, and a tiny feathered hat perched on his head are just plain awesome. He has this look of surprise on his face, his eyes wide. He kind of really looks like a young Captain Spaulding, to be honest, with his bald head and all. We'll post a pic on social media.
Paul met a beautiful trapeze artist named Elsie, and the two fell in love and got married, traveling 8 months of the year with the circus and living in Tampa, Florida on their off time, where they ran a laugh factory, a shop that sold costumes and clown props, most of which Paul created himself.
Paul used to say, "The reason we all stay on with the circus is that there's no thrill on earth like the first big roaring laugh from the audience on opening night."
Eventually dubbed the King of the Clowns by his fellow circus performers, Paul was what they call in the business a, quote, producing clown, end quote, meaning he wrote skits and created the props.
Here are some of the wacky skits this guy invented. And I'm actually old enough to remember seeing the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus in the early 80s as a kid, a little kid, and they were still doing the same routines all those years later. So this is the stuff that used to thrill kids back in the day, long before the internet. So there's this giant monster clown. And remember, this guy was a prop maker. So he made all these legendary circus props. So he had this crazy giant clown monster stumbling around trying to get the other clowns. And they would catch the terrifying monster clown and put it into a crusher. It's kind of like a guar show. And out of the crusher would come pouring all these little people clowns. There was a lot of little people clowns, or as they called them back in the day, midget clowns, in the circus. And he used them in all kinds of skits. He'd have them running around dressed like firemen, trying to rescue a woman from a burning building, all falling over themselves, the wacky hijinks. And he'd shoot them out of cannons. And he'd even bring out the fat lady from the freak show, have her go through a weight loss routine, and then little clowns would all come pouring out of her. It's weird and wacky.
At one point, Paul suffered a severe hip injury, which forced him to walk with a limp. but he worked the injury into the show, becoming a limping hobo clown with a waddling gait, having trained ducks following after him, walking in the same waddling manner, which never failed to elicit laughs from the audience.
He was also apparently the first guy to come up with the sunglasses that had glowing eyes in them. And I actually had a pair of those as a kid. Man, I love them. I used to wear them around thinking I looked so cool.
I'm sure you looked super cool. By 1965, Paul Young was the long reigning king of the clowns, and still going strong. In April, the Ringling Brothers' Barnum and Bailey Circus were performing to standing room only crowds of 18,000, plus in New York City's Madison Square Garden.
Paul liked to stay close to Madison Square Garden during the long runs there, so he could just walk back to his room after the shows.
He stayed at a place called the Forest Hotel, just 1 block away. It's an area known for hustlers. There's always ticket scalpers lurking everywhere around the garden, as well as bootleg t-shirt and novelty dealers, and Times Square is just a straight shot down 7th Avenue.
Even way back in the 1950s, Times Square had become a seedy place full of hustlers and dealers. Remember in our William Burroughs episodes, he was hanging out there, scoring and selling guns, morphine, and heroin. It's where he famously met Herbert Huncke. And by 1965, Times Square was just full of porn shops, topless bars, strip clubs, and the very first 25-cent peep shows were just beginning to pop up. It was also an area teeming with sex workers, many of them strung out and desperate.
On the morning of April 21st, 1965, the other clowns at the circus became concerned when Paul hadn't arrived by curtain time, something that had never happened before. They go to his hotel looking for him, but he doesn't answer the door.
So they call the bell captain of the hotel, which is the head of the bellboys, something I didn't know. And the bell captain let himself into room 1211, where he was greeted with a most horrific sight. There, laying face up across the narrow entryway to the bedroom, was the king of the clowns, drenched in blood, covered with a bedsheet. He was clad in just pajama bottoms and an undershirt, his hands tied behind his back, his head and face brutally beaten in. But it was a mystery, as there was no signs of a forced entry.
Homicide detectives interviewed 1,500 people, all to no avail, but were eventually able to track the clown's typewriter in a pawn shop, which led them to 2 heroin addicts named Alan Jones and Marion DeBerry. Marion DeBerry, who had a long rap sheet for prostitution, quickly confessed and stated Alan had beaten the clown to death with the brass nozzle of a fire hose before stealing $40 and the typewriter which led to their arrest.
The detailed information on this crime was actually kind of difficult to get. Just his cause of death was a pain to find. There's like a ton of articles out there about his life and his time with the circus, but they all simply state he was killed and really don't say how. I found an old AP newspaper clipping. It was like a Xerox of the actual newspaper someone had put online, but it had been cut off right at the point where they say how they find the body. I could see that it said something about his hands being tied and something about his skull, but I finally found a cool blog by David K. Frazier, a very interesting guy, and that one filled in all the details, so thank you, David Frazier. Interestingly, several articles state that the woman had been in his hotel room with him and then at some point had let her boyfriend in, which is why there were no signs of forced entry, though it is never stated what this heroin-addicted prostitute was doing in the 65-year-old married circus clown's room.
A very valid question. Marion testified for the prosecution, saying her boyfriend had bludgeoned the elderly clown to death for $40 because he was in heroin withdrawal.
That's very, very sad. No life is worth $40, but especially the world's greatest clown.
Man, yeah, such a shame. But Alan claimed it was a setup, and Marion had made a false confession after being intimidated and threatened during the long interrogation. He claimed the cops needed to pin it on someone, and they were their patsies.
But Marion testified for the prosecution, had her charge lowered to third-degree assault, for which she would serve less than 2 years. Alan Jones was convicted of first-degree murder on October 17th, 1967, and sentenced to life imprisonment.
Sugar Smacks went on to find other clowns to promote their cereal.
But then they moved to a different mascot. What else do kids love besides sugar and clowns? Cartoon frogs.
I remember the Sugar Smacks of the Cartoon Frog iteration. In the 1980s, when parents began to worry about the sugar content in their children's food, Kellogg's changed the name to Honey Smacks. But the actual sugary product, they didn't change that a bit, keeping the sugar content at a whopping 51%.
You can't improve perfection.
I mean, I can taste that cereal right now. Let's be serious.
Me too. This is good stuff.
Yeah. A 1965 article reporting the death of Paul Young read, quote, "It was a tragic end for the good-humored funny man who made a career making 3 generations of Americans laugh." End quote.
I'm Sam Rossi.
And I'm AJ Carey.
Join us every Wednesday as we summarize and discuss true crime on Killing 15 Minutes.
That's right, 15 minutes or less on some sick puppies, serial killers, and criminals. Every Wednesday.
I write it, AJ reads it. Available on all major audio platforms.
And please follow us on all major social media outlets as well.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, for our third and main act, we bring you Folie à Deux, the tale of the Papin Sisters, Christine and Leah.
In Le Mans, France, on February 2nd, 1933, René Lancelin, a retired legal practitioner, went to his house at 6 Rue Bruyère to meet his wife and daughter, as they were all going out to a dinner party that evening, only to find the door locked and the house dark and still. So he headed off to the party, but they were not there either, and the guests said they had not heard or seen them.
He waited impatiently at the dinner party for their arrival, but soon grew concerned and headed back to his home again, bringing his son-in-law along with him. The entire house was locked and bolted tight, and the windows were completely dark, except one room on the top floor, the servants' quarters, where a single candle appeared to be lit, glowing eerily in the darkness.
Police were dispatched and climbed over the garden wall. There, at a back entrance, they were able to jimmy open a glass door and make entry. The house was pitch dark. They try the light switch and nothing happens. The power appears to be off. So the officers use flashlights to illuminate the blackness, calling out,
"Bonjour, c'est la police."
There was nothing, only eerie silence. They crossed the base of the stairs, where an officer noticed a strange round object, like a marble, gleaming in his flashlight beam. He picked it up and gaped at it, horror-struck as he realized it was a human eye.
Casting their beams up the steps, there on the landing, they could see 2 bodies sprawled out in puddles of blood and posed most obscenely.
The bodies were those of René's missing wife and daughter, Leonie and Guinevere.
Guinevere Lancelin was face down, her right arm extended, her hand drenched in blood with clumps of hair stuck in it. Her underwear had been pulled down and her skirt lifted up, exposing her legs and buttocks. Legs spread, and there were deep lacerations on her thighs and calves. Her head was battered, and her eyes had been ripped from their sockets.
Leonie Laslin lay on her back, also with her underwear pulled down and her skirt lifted up. Posed with her legs spread obscenely wide, wearing one shoe on her right foot. The right side of her face and skull were completely smashed in. There was literally nothing left of the lower part of her face. Even the skull had been crushed and teeth lay scattered about the body. Her eyes had been ripped from their sockets as well. Bloody combs and hairpins lay about the carnage. A bloody kitchen knife lay beside the bodies, as well as a metal vase drenched in gore.
Blood splatter on the walls reached upwards of 2 meters high.
The magistrate and coroner were called as police began a thorough search of the house, thinking the killer may still be inside, as all the locks had been locked from within. Monsieur René Laslin is not allowed to enter his home and see the fate of his wife and daughter, despite his protests.
The 3 bedrooms are searched, turning up nothing suspicious. Police then move to the upper floor. They find an iron on an ironing board beside a wrinkled shirt, as if the work had been abruptly interrupted.
There is only one room left, the servants' room. The door is locked from the inside. They call out,
Police, ouvre la porte, police, police.
but they get no answer.
So they call in a locksmith. Yeah, a locksmith. It strikes me as kind of odd. Today, the door would unceremoniously be smashed quickly down. But the bourgeoisie were treated with respect by the working class, which included the police, I suppose. Must be very delicate about these situations. Even though, someone could be literally dying in the other room, bleeding to death. But, it was probably a very, very nice door.
Indeed. So the locksmith picks the lock, and the key is still in the mechanism on the other side of the door. And it falls out, clattering to the ground.
Spooky.
The door swings open, and there in the eerie candlelight are the 2 servant girls, sisters, lying in bed together, naked. Beside them on a stool, the single forlorn candle burned. Beside it was a hammer, drenched in blood, bits of bone, and human hair.
The older sister sat up in bed and said,
"We were expecting you."
It's a crazy scene, but we have to confess it is disputed whether they were naked or in bathrobes. Some sources, including Wikipedia, claim that they were in fact naked, but Wikipedia has been wrong before. And a lot of other sources say they were clad only in robes. I don't know. Regardless, the 2 sisters, Christine Léa Papin, it's spelled Papin, but all the documentaries I watch, they say Papin. So I don't know. I don't speak French, but and a lot of this is French. And everything good about this case is unfortunately written in French as well, but whatever, I digress. The 2 sisters quickly confessed right there while still in bed.
When police asked them, point blank,
"What did you do to your mistress?"
Christine answered, "They wanted to hit me, so I got my own back. It was either us or them. I would rather do my masters in than let them do us in."
Leah then cries out that it was she who had murdered Guinevere. And Christine calmly replies that she had murdered Léonie, the mother. Leah then said,
"They shouldn't have threatened us. They threatened us and, well, they got what was coming to them."
The police demand the sisters get up out of bed, but Christine then boldly states,
"Only if I want to."
But after some cajoling, the 2 sisters get out of bed and get dressed. Police continue questioning them, but the sisters go quiet and stubborn.
The press goes crazy. The Sarthe newspaper and the Ost Eclair are the 2 main regional papers, and they begin to try to outdo each other with sensational headlines about gouged eyes, crushed skulls, and even a possible incestuous and lesbian affair.
Forensics was actually a known science in France at this point. The first literary detective was even French, of course. See Edward Dupin, a character penned by Edgar Allan Poe, before the word detective had even been invented. And in the real world, the French had Edmond Locard, an internationally acclaimed forensic expert who created the first forensic laboratory in Lyon and wrote many books and acclaimed articles and taught that the crime scene is crucial. Nothing should be touched, that the smallest element might be an important clue or help to reconstruct the events and their order.
But the Papin murders were not investigated in that painstaking manner. Since the scene had initially been dark and the police were using flashlights, there was a lot of fumbling about, stepping over the bodies. The locksmith had also trampled through, and since the press were allowed to come in and photograph the bodies, even though the husband was kept out, the police pulled the woman's skirts down so that their genitals wouldn't be exposed when the bodies were photographed.
There are some gruesome, gruesome photographs. The only recognizable part of Leone's head is an ear there, sticking out in the gore. Remember the Lizzie Borden case? They put socks on Andrew Gordon because they thought his bare ankles were obscene.
Yeah, that's just crazy. Christine said during subsequent questioning that Leonie and Guinevere had come home from shopping at 5. Christine told her mistress that the iron, which had broken and was recently fixed, had blown the fuse to the lights and was the reason why the house was dark. And they hadn't fixed it, but decided to wait until morning, at which point Leonie went into a rage and stormed toward her with her hand raised to strike.
And here's where you really see a lot of conflicting information. Because you can find one article saying Leonie physically and verbally abused the sisters, screaming at them and going so far as to grab them and smack their heads into the wall. And then you can turn around and read another article that says she literally never even spoke to them, just had notes with instructions handed to them, and that not once had they ever communicated with Renee, and that he didn't even look at them. And honestly, I don't know what sources to trust. Some say Leonie had been abusing the sisters, that she'd fallen into a deep depression and lashed out at the girls. Others say that's not true, and they were treated well and given lots of free time to do as they pleased, but their mistress was incredibly indifferent to them. I don't know. I wasn't there. And a lot of this stuff, as I said, is all in French. But either way, Christine says that she, quote,
leapt at her and tore at her face, ripping her eyes out with my fingers.
And the story changes slightly here and there, but that part of the tale is never questioned. Christine leaping upon her mistress and tearing her eyes out from her head with her fingers.
Christine went on to describe how after blinding Leonie, she grabbed a metal pot or vase and began to bash her mistress in the head. And Leah had come rushing up and jumped into the melee, holding her down just about the same time as Guinevere showed up, all on that landing between the 2 levels of the house.
Christine then ordered her sister to blind Guinevere as well, saying,
smash her head in the ground and tear her eyes out.
As Leah ripped the eyes from Guinevere's head and bashed her with a metal vase, Christine ran down to the kitchen and fetched a hammer and knife. And then she, in her own words,
lashed out at our 2 mistresses.
In a frenzy, they mutilated Guinevere and Leonie, crushing their faces to pulp with the hammer, lifting the women's skirts, pulling off their underwear, the sisters trading their weapons back and forth as they hacked and hammered at them, slashing at the thighs of the mistresses, now long dead, and spreading their legs in a sexually explicit manner. And no one seems to really talk about the aspects of this being a sexual assault. That's something you really don't see often with women killers. And they definitely sexually assaulted them. I mean, there's even one report that claims Leonie was menstruating and they wiped the soiled napkin on her. Ugh. But either way, this is no ordinary murder. It's a crime of passion and it's extreme sexual depravity.
The sisters then washed up, went to their room, bolted the door, and went to bed.
Christine finished the interview by saying,
I have no regrets. I did not plan my crime. I have no hatred towards them, but I will not accept the gesture that Ms. Lancelin had for me tonight.
that must have been some gesture. Thousands attended the funeral procession, lining the streets. There were black horses pulling a black hearse containing Léonie in the lead, followed by white horses pulling a white hearse for Guinevere, white signifying her youth.
A psychiatric evaluation of the two sisters was called for, which detailed their lives and offers a great written history of the two women.
Their father, Gustave, married their mother, Clémence, in October of 1901, but his parents did not approve of the marriage and considered her to be a, quote, scheming woman. She'd had a scandalous affair with her boss, which had been revealed and caused her to be the cause of much gossip in the town.
But she was already pregnant and they were wed, their first child, Amelia, being born in February of 1902. But it said she showed no signs of affection for either her child or her husband, and Gustave, suspecting she was still sleeping with her old boss, moved the family away from the village, finding work at a sawmill a couple 100 miles away.
Clémence is irate. She doesn't want to move. She threatens divorce, even suicide. But she's actually pregnant again and finally relents, giving birth to her daughter, Christine, on March 18th, 1905.
The couple are having terrible fights, and Gustave has his sister Belle, who hates men but has always longed for a child, raise Christine, as he thinks the tumultuous household is no place for an infant. Christine stays with her Aunt Belle for 7 years, years she would say were the best of her life.
In 1911, Gustave and Clémence have their third child, Léa. But by this time, Gustave had become a terrible alcoholic, and the couple soon divorced. Little baby Léa was sent to Clémence's brother to be raised, and Amelia and Christine were sent to an orphanage.
Amelia then joins a convent, which Christine planned to do as well. But Clémence was suspicious of the Catholic Church, hated that Amelia was in a convent, and in 1920 pulled Christine from the orphanage when she was 15, dashing her hopes of one day being a nun and hiring her off as a maid.
For 6 years, Christine made the rounds as a servant girl in numerous households, during which time Léa started work as a maid as well, and the two often worked together. In 1926, Christine was hired by Monsieur René Lancelin to be a live-in maid. After years of excellent service, she requested her sister be allowed to join her, and the family agreed, and Léa moved into the house on 6 Rue Bruyère as well.
Christine was very affectionate with Léa, trying to reciprocate the love her aunt gave her, and knowing their own mother never showed any affection to Léa. For 7 years, the sisters worked there, with nothing untoward happening until the night of the murders.
The report noted the strong attachment Christine held towards Léa and said she had no feelings for anyone else, though there was no sign of anything sexual to their relationship. The report concluded by saying, quote, neither of them acted on the advice of the other, but independently and on their own, end quote, saying the viciousness of the assault was the result of the, quote, communion of their own impulses and ideas, and the responsibility was fully shared by each of them.
Though the report states that there was no sign of sexuality between the two sisters, some modern historians do believe the sisters may have been lovers. Homosexuality was illegal under French law at the time, not to mention the incestual aspect.
French historian Frédéric Chauveau believes the crime itself occurred because the sisters were discovered to be lovers, and it is that which brought about the savage murders.
Chavard postulates that Madame Leonie Lanceling had walked in on them together, naked in bed, and the sisters then threw on their bathrobes, chased her as she went down the steps, catching her on the landing, where they ripped her eyes out, the very eyes that had seen them in the act of lovemaking.
Well, it's like a reverse Oedipus kind of thing. You see this concept of the eyes being symbols of guilt that need to be removed, like the play Equus by Peter Schaefer. Have you ever read that?
I haven't.
It's pretty fucked up. It's like this weird kid is obsessed with horses, and since the horses see him having sex, he cuts out their eyes. But it's actually based on a true story where a teenager blinded 6 horses.
Jesus Christ, it's brutal and senseless. Also, the Tooth Fairy from Red Dragon puts shards of broken mirror in his victim's eyes.
Richard Ramirez took some eyes. I don't think he was being poetic, though. He's just a fucked up person.
They say the eyes are the windows to the soul.
Oh, touche. The investigation into the sisters lasted for 25 weeks, during which Christine began to have an emotional breakdown, finally telling investigators the truth was that she hadn't been provoked at all. She just had a nervous fit and attacked her mistress out of nowhere. Just grabbed a pewter pot and started bashing her in the head and ripped her eyes out. And then Leia came running down to see what the commotion was at the same moment that Guinevere arrived. She claimed it wasn't Leia's fault, that she just acted on an impulse to help her sister.
Christine starts begging to see her sister, saying she can't live without her, and prison officials finally relent and allow the 2 sisters to see each other.
When Christine saw Leia, she supposedly threw herself at her, unbuttoning her blouse and saying,
Oui, s'il vous plaît, dites oui.
Which was taken to be proof of their incestual relationship. I mean, I don't know. Kind of seems like a beginning of a psychotic episode to me, maybe. But...
Then in July of 1933, Christine went into a violent fit of psychosis and attempted to rip her own eyes out, and had to be put in a straitjacket and held in a padded cell.
And on August 25th, 1933, the trial began. 200 police officers had to be lined up outside the courthouse to control the unruly mob that wanted to catch a glimpse of the infamous murdering sisters.
Christine and Leia pled innocent by reason of insanity and appeared timid and prim, heads down, only speaking in whispers. Christine admitted her guilt, but didn't elaborate on the crime or give a reason why she did it. Doctors for the prosecution testified that they could find no psychological disorder.
But the defense had discovered a history of mental illness in the family, an uncle who had committed suicide, and a cousin locked up in an asylum. And then, in a breathtaking fashion, a Dr. Lorraine dramatically claimed it wasn't either of the sisters who committed the crime, but a third person, who was the combination of the 2 sisters themselves. A folie à deux.
Famous psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan had written an article about the Papin sisters in the Minotaur Journal. The article was called The Motives of a Paranoid Crime, saying it was a form of folie à deux, or twin delirium. Today, the term shared delusion disorder is used for the phenomenon, which is quite spooky, as it can include shared hallucinations. At one time, these shared delusions and hallucinations were thought to be spread like a contagion. You could catch them from someone like a common cold.
Ooh, so creepy. It's kind of like David Cronenberg, a contagious mind disease that causes hallucinations and violent sex crimes. Very, very Videodrome.
Yeah, agreed. And there are 2 main subclassifications of folie à deux. The first is folie impulsée.
This is when a dominant person initially forms a delusional belief during a psychotic episode and imposes this belief on another person or persons.
Then there is folie simultanée.
This is when 2 people independently experience psychosis and then influence the content of each other's delusions so they become identical or strikingly similar, or one in which two people, quote, morbidly predisposed, end quote, to delusional psychosis mutually trigger symptoms in each other. Morbidly predisposed. You don't hear that expression enough, I don't think.
Though there was much talk of this disorder back in the early days of psychoanalysis, and the phenomenon is still mentioned, it is not in the current 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which considers the criteria to be insufficient or inadequate as a diagnosis in modern psychology or psychiatry.
And the jury didn't believe the insanity plea, and both the sisters were found guilty. Christine Papin was sentenced to death, to be publicly beheaded in the public square of Le Mans by guillotine. They didn't play around.
Leah Papin was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor and 20 years of exile.
But Christine's sentence was later commuted to a life sentence of hard labor, and she was able to avoid being publicly beheaded in the town square. But she refused to sign the clemency papers, was in a psychotic state. She refused to eat, saying she'd been sentenced to death, and that was it. She did not deserve to live. She was put in a mental asylum where she grew more delusional, to the point when a visit with her beloved sister Leah is arranged, Christine doesn't even recognize her. And on May 18th, 1937, Christine Papin died from pulmonary problems brought on by a lack of nutrition. She had starved herself to death.
Leah Papin, on the other hand, adapted well to prison life, working in a manufacturing plant making clothing, where she was considered a good worker. She made contact with her mother, and the two wrote often, developing a relationship. And on February 2nd, 1946, Leah was released from prison and went to live with her mother.
She'd stay there the rest of her life, living quietly, the infamy behind her, all the way until July 24th, 2001, when she passed away at 89 years old. And the sisters were buried together in the Cimetière Boutelier. Is that Boutelier?
I think the way you did it the first time around was fine.
Okay.
But the case itself has never died and probably never will. It lives on in the press and books, and has taken political and cultural overtones and become a source for literature and even an Academy Award-winning film.
Right when the case was breaking, a popular French true crime magazine called Détective boldly stated the sisters were a symbol of the repressed proletariat by the bourgeoisie, and ran a headline calling them enraged sheep and stating they were the slaves of the nouveau riche who exploited them. This magazine is actually still around today. Now it's called Nouveau Détective. It actually looks really cool, kind of sleazy-ish, true crime, lots of jokes. And like I said, unfortunately, I cannot read French, and it was just a hindrance to all the research on this case.
Supposedly French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre was a big fan of the magazine and thought that true crime was a reflection of society and a way to understand social groups and families.
See, Jean-Paul Sartre was a true crime fan. True crime is a study in existentialism. Enough said. The case became known as a crime of poverty and exploitation. And another literary philosopher and true crime fan, as well as part-time criminal, Jean Genet. He was like kind of a French William Burroughs. He's an amazing writer. I've read some of his stuff, translated, obviously. He wrote a play loosely based on the incident in 1947 called The Maids, which would later be turned into a movie in 1974.
And in 1964, Louis Degmore wrote an article about the crimes in Jean-Paul Sartre's journal Les Temps Modernes, or The Modern Times. This is over 30 years since the crime, and it was still being used as a hot cultural touchstone.
And over the years, there have been countless movies, songs, paintings, and books written about the Papin sisters and their crime, all the way until very, very recently when the movie Parasite was made, which is said to have been directly inspired by this story, which is something I did not know until I started doing the research. Because I love that movie. Oscar-winning movie inspired by this true crime case.
I had never heard that either. I love that movie as well.
Yeah, the servants kill the masters, and it's all about class struggle and stuff.
Interesting. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. 3 acts of murder and mayhem, from clowns to French servant sisters in rebellion.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, we bring you Satan Rock.
You may remember in our Shout at the Devil episode that Ed and Lorraine Warren claim that in 1979, they were called by Connecticut police after officers were attacked by a scourge of cloaked rock and roll cultists whose supernatural powers proved too powerful for law enforcement. Ed and Lorraine Warren claim that this cult then went on to invent the dreaded Satan Rock.
Now, we have searched high and low to find out who this rock and roll band from Connecticut was. But sadly, so far it appears that this is just more of Ed and Lorraine's bullshit gobbledygook supernatural lies. And there was no Satan rock band from Connecticut that attacked police in 1979. But we could be wrong. Please email murdercoasterpodcast@gmail.com if you know who this band is. But we have, in fact, discovered a couple of bands who do identify under the moniker of Satan Rock. So, for your ghoulish entertainment, we shall play you the dreaded Satan Rock that Ed and Lorraine Warren warned you about.
Our first band is Blackest Shabbos with the song Your Heart is Not a Vibrating Salamander, which is an incredible title. And it sounds like a Stephen Graham Jones book, I must say.
Let's hear it.
Let's hear it.
Okay, what do you think? I like it a lot. It reminds me of the Butthole Surfers. Definitely Paul Leary inspired guitar.
It's weird. It's not. I wouldn't listen to it and be like, oh, the Satanists are coming. It's kind of cool. It's different. I don't know if it's like whole nother genre different. What do you think about like the distinction?
I think that's something Ed and Lorraine Warren just made up.
Yeah, totally.
But I think this is really experimental. Fun. It's got a little bit of a rockabilly edge. It sounds a lot like the Butthole Surfers.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard them before. I don't listen to them. I never did listen to them regularly, so I don't know if I can.
It's got like jamming, freeform, like a long-winded guitar solo.
Yeah, I mean, I don't hate it. I will say I don't hate it.
I will go so far as to say I love it. Good job. Rock on.
Okay, rock on is right. You can find Blackest Shabbos on Bandcamp, and we will put a link in the show notes. And our next band is Star7Group with I Return Fire.
Ooh, yeah, I'm really digging this. Like it a lot. It's like a Rob Zombie over Black Sabbath sweet leaf riff.
This to me sounds like a Marilyn Manson knockoff.
Yeah, I can definitely hear the Black Sabbath influence. It's like a kind of like a grungy, newer Black Sabbath kind of sound. Yeah, I can hear the Marilyn Manson.
Yeah, I'm getting a lot of vibes of that. A lot of notes, a lot of warm Manson notes.
But they're incredibly talented. This is very good stuff.
Yeah, this sounds very professional.
Great stuff, good stuff. This is Star7Group. We're gonna let this play out for our end here, and thank you so much for listening, everybody. Check you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Return fire.